So hi, Steve. Thanks for coming out to my property. I have some erosion here. I'm not quite sure what's causing it. Can you help me understand that?
Right, so there are a lot of different potential causes of erosion, and bulkheads, as we mentioned, don't necessarily always address the root cause of erosion. Sometimes they can actually make it worse, and so it require a site-specific look at what's going on at your property, what are the processes that are shaping it, and what are some of the root causes of erosion, if that's something you're concerned about. And so there's a number of sources of erosion, as mentioned, and that could range from everything from just the wave action from the water, ocean waters, estuary waters, upland surface runoff, groundwater interacting with some of the geology that we kind of referred to earlier that we'll explain in more detail. Sometimes it can be the bulkhead itself, as mentioned, or a bulkhead of a neighboring site. And sometimes, we're just dealing with the natural level of erosion, and the structure is it's just a proximity issue where the structure is just very close to the edge of the bluff or the beach, and there we have to figure out alternatives at that point.
So how could we identify the difference between wave erosion and something that might be coming from above?
Sure. So just to talk about wave erosion a little more. So what can happen with wave erosion is we have these waves coming in from the left, and that can the action and the force of the water, especially if there's a large open distance of unobstructed water, the wind can pick up and bring a lot of energy. That distance is called the fetch, and if you have a long fetch, that you can have a higher energy environment. And so you have all that open water carrying these waves, high energy, and that can be crashing onto your shoreline, especially during storm events or higher tides. And those waves can also sometimes be carrying particles or debris, large wood, things like that. They can also lead to further erosion. And so what that can end up looking like on your shoreline is you can get kind of this undercutting like you might see on a riverbank. And that's not necessarily always a problem. In this case, we can see there's a lot of natural vegetation protecting the bluff. And although we are getting some of this kind of undercutting here, kind of under the mean high water line, this is a natural process, and it's not necessarily a problem depending on the proximity of your structure.
Okay, and if it is a problem, what could I do?
Right. So, if it is something you're worried about, we can look into certain options, and some of those options might include, again, sometimes taking no action. If many areas in Puget Sound are relatively low energy when it comes to erosion, it's just going to depend on your site specifically. A lot of times vegetation can do a lot to help hold the slope together. There's certain types of vegetation that can do pretty well, especially lower in the tidal frame. We have things like dune grass that can help buffer wave energy on the shoreline, and willows and things a little further back. And you can see in this example, vegetation is holding up the bluff together pretty well. There's not necessarily a lot of imminent risk of erosion from wave action alone. In other cases, we can look at a little bit more of a engineered approach where we're adding gravel or cobble to the beach. Call that beach nourishment. That will be appropriate in certain situations, and less appropriate in others. And we'll talk about that more later.
So I just paved my driveway, and I'm seeing a change in the runoff on my property.
Sure. So, yeah, that's a good question. We'll talk a bit more about drainage later, but surface runoff can be a big player oftentimes in affecting the stability of our slopes and erosion patterns we might be seeing. And so, we've talked about these bigger scale trends of a lot of deforestation that has occurred, including along our shorelines. As we develop them, often we want to get a nice view, and we all want to have a nice place on the shoreline, but it's all about trying to find a balance. In some ways, having more vegetation can soak up more of that water and prevent surface runoff-induced erosion. And so if we have more impervious surfaces and less vegetation, like more driveways, more sidewalks, more patios, that also doesn't mean you can't have those. It just means you might have to help compensate for that in some cases by managing your drainage and working on vegetation. Otherwise, you might see kind of development of some rills and gullies like this. If you have freshwater creeks or little streamlets on your property, those also can be aggravated. You can get more channelization and more runoff flowing through those streams as well in these scenarios.
So what should I do?
Right. So yeah, as I mentioned, or alluded to, taking a look at how to manage the drainage from your rooftops and your driveways, and so on, and also looking at planting native vegetation where appropriate and leaving the vegetation you have where appropriate. And we'll have a whole section on drainage management and vegetation management in a little bit.
Okay. Wow, this was dramatic. What happened here?
Yeah, so this is a good example of what could happen when your slope is really saturated and you live in kind of historically a little bit more of an unstable area due to the geology. So as I talked about here, we have kind of this hard pan layer here where if we get a lot of water coming through, it gets to a consolidated layer where it can't infiltrate very much anymore, and there's not much vegetation, as you can see, upslope to soak up some of that water. And so you get that buildup of water, and that weight and that force pushes some of the slope kind of laterally, and you can see a slide like this. This is a particularly dramatic example, but we can see this occasionally. And so thinking about how to, the point is not to be big, bad, and scary, but just that it's really important, of course, to be looking at your drainage and your upland water sources as well, and looking at also your soil type and how those interact to try to make a plan to move forward and manage your erosion risk.
Okay, so what are we going to do on this property?
So yeah, similarly, think about solutions similar to our runoff situation. A lot of surface runoff can also interact with our groundwater, so those things are kind of connected. So we want to be looking at drainage management actions and looking into planting more native vegetation where we can. And again, we'll describe those in more detail in a little bit.
So I've noticed a change in my beach. What's happening here?
Yeah, so as Katrinka referenced earlier, sometimes we can get a loss of beach, and due to some of the kind of changing wave energy dynamics and sediment supply dynamics that we get when we put in a bulkhead. And so if you're getting a loss of beach and you're seeing that kind of erosion, in some cases that might be caused by the bulkhead itself, and in that, or a combination of other, and possibly a combination of other factors. And so in those situations, we're going to need to take a close look and see if we can, sometimes removing the bulkhead can actually solve your problem.
Okay, let's see what the solutions given are.
Right, so as I just mentioned, I got a little ahead of myself, but yeah, bulkhead removal and sometimes supplementing that with other actions like planting vegetation in its place, or pursuing kind of a semi-engineered, semi-natural approach like that we like to call a soft shore approach. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that means in a little bit as well.
My grandparents gave me this property and they built it a long time ago, and the edge of the bluff is just creeping closer and closer.
Right, so yeah, that's important and something we see sometimes, and in some cases there's not a whole lot we can do about it, unfortunately. And sometimes we have to, even if we were to put a bulkhead, we'd still, that may be a fix in some situations, but we still might be dealing with some upland related issues. And so at the end of and bulkheads will eventually fail. So in some cases, the best long-term investment could be to try to elevate or relocate your structure. And we understand that's an expensive investment, but we have to be also realistic about the risks we're facing over the near and long term and try to make the best path forward. And so some potential solutions to that, as I referred to, is potentially relocating or elevating your structure. A lot of times we get discussion about, or questions about beach access. A lot of times it's not the structure people are worried about, but a changing or eroding beach access pathway or something like that. And that beach access pathway, depending on how it's designed or the staircase or whatever, can also impact habitat and erosion and other things. And so we'd love to work with you on thinking about how to better design your beach access to make it suit your needs and ensure that longevity, and also balancing it with your natural resources. And then the last option is just if you're siting a new property, if you've recently purchased a new shoreline property and wanting to structure a new house or a new structure, just be liberal about the setback distance you're putting with the bluff, and make sure you think about consulting a geologist and making sure you have enough setback to mitigate your risk of erosion in the future, just by virtue of where the structure is located.
We often say, use the setback recommended by the county and then add another 50 feet. Put it back as far as you can on your property.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So what are some actions I can take if I'm not seeing problems right now, but I want to avoid them in the future?
Right, so there's a lot of things we can do, and some of which we've already referred to, and that can include diverting rainwater runoff from your slopes and managing your vegetation in a healthy way. So leaving the vegetation that's there, especially if it's native, adding new native vegetation where you can, building stairs or trails in a way that is going to allow for more natural erosion, and work with nature in a way that will allow your access to be sustainable, and then set back all infrastructure. And that includes not just your house, but your wells and your septics and things like that. And also we want to be careful about some things to avoid. And so, where possible, don't avoid removing your native trees. Don't top them where you don't need to. Don't remove native vegetation, and don't build trails straight down to the beach. And again, we'll talk more about how to best manage your native vegetation in a little bit. And so yeah, that's that for that part.
Yeah, so maybe the best choice is to do nothing sometimes.
Right. So erosion is a natural process, and sometimes we need some patience and acceptance. And where that's not feasible, sometimes the best solution is to look into more natural approaches, or restoring some of the impact of the development that's occurred upslope. And so that could sometimes take the place of managing your drainage to compensate for the increase in impervious surfaces and deforestation that has occurred, adding more vegetation. So things like that can help mitigate your risk in a lot of situations. And removing your bulkhead sometimes can help, or pursuing soft shore alternatives to bulkheads can help sometimes too, if you're still having erosion concerns. It's just going to be site specific, and we love to work with you. So we're really excited to work with you on your shoreline goals, and we have there's a lot of rich history of these types of projects and restoration projects that our program and other programs in the area, in the region, have done, and we're happy to point you to some past examples and work with you on your shoreline goals.